Awesome. Well, thanks for that. Yes, I am recently engaged. That now makes me an authority on all things love and relationships, so feel free to come on up and I'll give you the lowdown on how it all works. But it's great to have you here on the final day of this relevant series. Not sure if you're maybe just joining us for the first time or you've been coming to things throughout this week, but it's great to have you here as we have these conversations on questions that I think really matter. And one of those questions is the one we're looking at today. We might think this would be a topic better addressed at the beginning of the week, but I still think it's relevant for us now. God, why should I care? Why should I even care to look into this question of whether God exists and whether it makes a difference in my life? In 2014, Oxford University Press published a book on what's known to be one of the largest growing categories of religious people in the West. And it's those who define themselves as spiritual but not religious. And within this broad category, the author points out various typologies, ranging from those who call themselves spiritual explorers and who are actively pursuing different religions to find what's true for them, all the way to people who call themselves dissenters, people who would say, I'm actively against organized religion, but I'm still spiritual. But as she looked at millennials, and I think I still qualify to be in the same age bracket as you guys, what she found was that the overwhelming category was those who called themselves casual in relation to spirituality. And she elaborated this with her own definition. Casuals are those for whom spirituality is something that neither captures their full attention nor serves as an organizing principle for their lives. They may read books on spirituality, seek out a teacher, or attend services and rituals occasionally, but only on an as-needed basis. It's an approach to spirituality that's primarily functional. What can I get out of the spirituality for me? And I want to begin just by looking at something of what sociologists have said about what has brought us to this place where perhaps 300 years ago we are deeply religious, but now this question of apathy and what really can religion offer me is the main game in town. And I'm going to do it by an ugly drawing, which you'll see with my great drawing skills, but I hope it will get across something that sociologists have tried to propose. One of the most well-known Canadian sociologists and philosophers is a guy named Charles Taylor, who's based out of McGill University in Montreal. And he speaks about a timeline across the last 500 years in the West that charts out the way that average Westerners have approached the question of God and spirituality. And he begins by speaking about what he speaks of, what he calls a sacramental view of reality, which he dates back to the Middle Ages. And by this, he just means that there was a time when both the spiritual world and the physical world existed actually as one permeating entity. And he points out this was the time where things like the Mass were taken very seriously, where there were relics and shrines, sacred places, where people actually believed the divine world was just right behind the physical world, and that the physical world we related to had all of these spiritual realities behind them. But he then says the next step in history was that the Reformation happened. And how he describes this is a line got shot through this unified level of reality. And people began instead to think about, on the one hand, a spiritual reality, the second story, and a physical reality, the one in which we live on this first floor. The Reformers thought a lot of the relics and the shrines were just superstition. There is no supernatural spirit behind those different things. Actually, we're speaking here of a divide between two separate worlds. Taylor goes on to argue that this progressed into the Enlightenment, where you had people like Immanuel Kant draw out the distinctions between how we can know about the physical and the supernatural. And Kant basically said, look, when it comes to what's physical, we can know that stuff for sure. We can use science, we can use our senses to tell things that are actually real and true about reality. But when it comes to this second story, the level of the supernatural, well, that's going to have to remain shrouded in mystery. There's going to have to be some kind of unknowability about this upper floor. Kant was someone who would say he believed in God, but I think he wanted to say in his humility, because this floor was not as knowable as the bottom one, he couldn't say for sure what that upper story was like. And I think this is part of the inheritance we have as millennials in the West. I think it explains a few things. One, I do think it explains a bit of some apathy that we inherit in our culture. There's a sense in which, because it's so unknowable what God is like, in a way, the exploration we could do, yes, that could be helpful for some people for whom religion is helpful, but on the whole, it's a bit fruitless. We go into the divine mystery to foray and pull out things that help us, but really we can't get our minds all around it. But I think the second implication for us as millennials is that it makes us feel that it's very intolerant for anyone to say they have the whole truth. Because isn't it that the reality is it's not physical, it's mysterious, it's divine, therefore your view is as good as mine. It seems narrow-minded for someone to say, my religion is the only one that's true. But the third thing that I think sociologists are starting to talk about is the effect of how the removal of the supernatural from most normal people's lives has actually reshaped the way they engage with things they care about on the physical level. This talk is titled, God, Why Should I Care? I began by speaking about my fiance and saying I'm now this expert on love. And actually, of course I'm not, but I am going to speak about that as one of the themes that I think reflects this stratified world in which we find ourselves as millennials, and why I think this question of apathy and why we should care about God leads into deeper questions that relate to our everyday lives. Another sociologist who was actually also Canadian but passed away in the 1970s was a guy named Ernest Becker, and he earned the Pulitzer Prize in Literature for his book, The Denial of Death. And in this book, he lays out his thesis that even though most of us in the West, statistically, maybe don't have religion as central a place in their lives as before, he says there still is something within the modern man that looks for transcendence, that looks for a source of meaning and value and purpose, the kind of things that in the past we looked to for religion. Now, he says, we go to other places to find them. And one of those places is we go to relationships and love. And I just want to read this quote to you from him as he describes what's going on. He says, modern man has edged himself into an impossible situation. We still need to feel heroic. We need to feel that our life matters in the grand scheme of things. We still want to merge ourselves with some higher, self-absorbing meaning and trust and gratitude. But if you don't have God, how do you do this? One of the first ways that occurred to the modern person was the romantic solution. The self-glorification that we need in our innermost being, we now look for in our love partner. To be sure, throughout history, human love has been in competition with divine love. We can think of Heloise and Abelard, or Absiliades and Socrates, but the main difference is that in the religious society, the human partner would not absorb into himself the whole dimension of the divine longing. In the modern society, he does. What Becker was arguing is that one of the ways that still we long for transcendence, we long, even if we're not spiritual, we still are looking for meaning and purpose and value. Well, one of the things we do is we look for that in our love partners, in the relationships that we form. And he actually went on to quote Freud, who had this idea that actually religion is just suppressed sexuality. And he pushed back on that and said, perhaps actually sexuality is repressed religion. That there is something within us that longs to be a part of something greater than us, and yet when we confine ourselves just to the physical sphere, we end up needing to find that sort of transcendence through perhaps the relationships that we are a part of. And I think on the popular level, one of the most amusing illustrations of this actually comes from a song called High on Loving You by a band called Florida Georgia Line. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. The title itself of the song, High on Loving You, actually spells out holy. So it's abbreviated H.O.L.Y. And I just want to read you some of the lyrics of this song to give you a sense of, I think, what Becker is talking about in terms of how we can now look to our relationships to give us the kind of satisfaction and meaning and joy and transcendence that religion used to provide. Listen to the religious language in this song. You made the brightest days from the darkest nights. You're the riverbank where I was baptized. Cleanse all my demons that were killing my freedom. Let me lay you down, get you singing, babe, hallelujah. We'll be touching heaven. You're an angel. Tell me you're never leaving, because you're the first thing I know I can believe in. You're holy, holy, holy. I'm high on loving you, high on loving you. I think what that song is getting at is that for many of us, it's the relationships that we're in that we seek our deepest joy in. We feel deeply lonely when we don't have them. Perhaps we can sense that our life is not worth living if we can't one day meet that one person who can fulfill us in the way that we're hoping. But even as I think we look to our deepest joys, I think we also come across in our relationships some of our deepest pains. I love the song in Les Mis that Fantine sings, reflecting on the man who abandoned her as a younger woman and left her with a child. She says, "He slept a summer at my side. He filled my days with endless wonder. He took my childhood in his stride, but he was gone when autumn came." Sorry, I should be singing this like Anne Hathaway, but I'm not going to go for it. "And still I dream he'll come to me, that we will live the years together. But there are dreams that cannot be, and there are storms we cannot weather. I had a dream my life would be so different from this hell I'm living, so different now from what it seemed. Now life has killed the dream I dreamed." I think what Becker goes on to point out is that this divinization, this transcendizing of our relationships is something that ultimately leaves us frustrated, not just when it doesn't work out, but even when it does. There still sometimes can be something that we're left longing in the relationships we're in, a dissatisfaction. And he puts this in good sociological language, writing this: "But no human being can bear the weight of godhood. What is it we want when we elevate the love partner to this position? We want to be rid of our faults, our feeling of nothingness. We want to be justified, to know that our existence has not been in vain. We want redemption, nothing less. Needless to say, the love partner cannot give us this." And I think that, I know for me personally, I wonder if many of you as well, we resonate with the sense in which we do sometimes put too much stock in our relationships. And often it is only when they fall through, or when we get disappointed and we're shocked by the way that it affects us and how low it gets us, that we begin to realize that we put a kind of faith in something that actually is, Becker would argue, just as religious as if we were members of a certain faith. But I think at the same time, there's something about love that we don't just give up on. I think there's something that we still romantically portray as essential to the way the world works. A few years ago, the movie Interstellar came out, one of the latest Christopher Nolan classics. And the theme of love and the transcendence of love and everything weaves through the whole movie. And what's interesting about it is it's really a movie about science. And there's a sense in which when we think about questions of love, science alone gives us a pretty straightforward answer. Love exists in order to pass our genes along. The kind of romantic feelings you have and that Anne Hathaway sings about, they are lovely perhaps, but at the end of the day, nothing more than neurons firing just in order to look for survival. And yet in this context of science, this conversation happens in one moment between Cooper and Brand, two of these astronauts on the spaceship as they're looking for a new home for planet Earth. They have a human colony that they're ready to plant, but they're trying to decide which planet to visit. They have two options, but not enough fuel, it seems, to visit both. And it comes out that Brand actually is hoping to go to one of the planets because there's an astronaut there who first scoped that planet out, who she hasn't heard from a decade, but who still could be alive, and this astronaut she once loved. And Cooper points out that this is clouding her vision and making her biased on the decision they're making. So here's the conversation that they have. Cooper says, "You're a scientist, Brand." And Brand says, "So listen to me when I say that love isn't something that we invented. It's observable, it's powerful, it has to mean something." And Cooper says, "Love has meaning, yes. Social utility, social bonding, child rearing." Brand cuts back, "We love people who have died. What is the social utility in that?" Brand says, she goes on to say, "Maybe it means something more, something we can't yet understand. Maybe it's some evidence, some artifact of a higher dimension that we can't consciously perceive. I'm drawn across the universe to someone I haven't seen in a decade, who I know is probably dead. Love is the one thing we're capable of perceiving that transcends dimensions of time and space. Maybe we should trust that, even if we can't understand it." "All right, Cooper, yes. The tiniest possibility of seeing Wolf again excites me. That doesn't mean I'm wrong." And you'll see, if you've watched how the movie ends, this idea is repeated all throughout, that actually there is something about love that we sense, even as it frustrates us in our relationships, is part of a larger reality, something that is just as real as scientific facts are, and it troubles this hard line that the Enlightenment has drawn between these transcending values like love that go beyond time and space and the physical world in which we live. And the question I want us to get us thinking about this afternoon is if that's the case, that most of us, I think, would want to say that our relationships aren't just pure selfish motivation to get our genes passed along, and there actually is something good and valuable and worth pursuing about love. Could that perhaps be a sort of indication from the physical, pointing up to a spiritual reality, the possibility that love is something that actually exists apart from the physical world that we are in, and is something that follows these contours of reality that makes it something we pursue and love and value? And I think that still might sound quite vague and leaves us with the dilemma that Charles Taylor still has pointed out. When it seems we approach the spiritual realm, okay, we can speak of love in general, God is love, but how could we ever know anything further than that, at least with any certainty? Nietzsche, in this time period, turn of the 20th century, went on to say, perhaps we should just eliminate the top story altogether. But a contemporary of Nietzsche who came a few decades later was another leading religious thinker in the 20th century, a guy named C.S. Lewis. And he proposed a way of reconciling these two realities that was far different from Nietzsche. He acknowledged this idea of the unknowability of a divine world. If we were just all creatures and there were a creator out there, how could we know him? But he invites us into a thought experiment. He was a professor of English literature at the University of Oxford. And I think this shapes the way he thought about these kind of things. He said, imagine you had Hamlet, a character in one of Shakespeare's plays. And Hamlet wanted to know something about Shakespeare. What could Hamlet do to bridge that gap? And Lewis's answer was, well, not very much. There's really nothing Hamlet could do to remove himself from his own timeline in the story to know anything about what Shakespeare was really like. But Lewis proposed that one possibility would be that Shakespeare could make himself known to Hamlet. That would not lie within Hamlet's power to get out of his own story, but Shakespeare, as the author, theoretically would have the possibility of writing himself into his own story, of writing himself actually as another character alongside Hamlet, and to show him what he was really like. I think most people today, if you ask on the streets what God is like, if there is a God, the attribute of love will come up at some point. But I think to go beyond just a vague kind of love that applies to this upper story, something like C.S. Lewis described would have to happen. In order for us to know something like this divine second realm, if the idea of love and other values have opened us up to the possibility of some things that are transcendent, I think what we would need is not a spaceship up to the second floor, but something from the second floor to come down and make itself known to us. And Lewis saw that this unique idea was at the heart of the Christian faith, that in the person of Jesus, God is stepping into the world and showing us what he is like. It's an interesting hypothesis, to say the least, and I think that even a strict materialist, a person like Richard Dawkins, would admit the possibility that that could happen. We have the universe as a box that we are living in, but are we so sure that nothing could come in from the outside and reveal to us what that external world might be like? And returning to this topic of love, I want to present to you today how I do think the love that we long for and yet are frustrated with on this earthly level points us to a kind of love that I think does have the power to satisfy the longings of the heart. And I think that comes through the way in which the Christian faith holds that God has stepped into our world to reveal himself to us. You go down the streets today, you ask anyone what they think of Jesus, you're probably going to get a pretty favorable response. You know, when anyone runs for political office today, the newspapers go digging up dirt on that person. But amazing, after 2,000 years, people generally still like Jesus. This has come up a few times throughout this week. And he embodied a kind of love that was beyond just superficial or just nice words. He would touch lepers. He would cross ethnic, cultural boundaries to show love to people who normally were excluded from that. He's forgiving the people who put him on the cross. But I think we need, if we're going to deal with the hypothesis of Lewis that this theoretically could be God visiting the world, we would need to think about, in his own terms, how Jesus saw himself as representing God. And in one moment in the Gospel of Mark, one of the biographies of Jesus, he says that his purpose of coming into the world was not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And that idea of a ransom has the sense of being an exchange. A ransom is something that's paid in order for something to go free. And this is reflecting this idea that Jesus' death on the cross paid for the sins of humanity. Now, when Mahatma Gandhi interacted with the Christian faith, and he, especially with this idea of the cross, he said, I love the idea of the cross as a sacrifice and an act of love for his friends. But this whole idea of it actually paying for our sins, I don't buy that part of the cross. And yet I think an interesting question can be raised to that way of thinking about the cross. I think many people, maybe you today, view that idea of the story of Jesus' cross as a beautiful story of love for his disciples, but this whole idea that he died to pay the price for my sins so that I could be forgiven, I don't buy that. But I wonder if we thought about it this way. The harbor down in Toronto is mostly frozen, but it's actually quite dangerous. It's, the governments keep trying to tell people to not walk out on the ice. But let's imagine that we've had a great week together. Maybe you've been around at a few talks. And let's say that after this talk, I say, why don't we just go on down, walk by the water a little bit? And we're walking there, and I just begin feeling really emotional. I'm recently engaged. I'm all in this lovey-dovey state, and I just start saying, I just want to show you guys how much I love you right now. And what do? I start walking out on the ice. And you all are standing back on the side, and you're like, all right, I wonder where he's going with this. I walk out as far as I can go. Eventually, I fall through the ice, and I drown. Are you guys going to look at each other and be like, man, he loved us so much? No, the reality is you'd be like, why? We should have seen this coming. Does the fiancé know what she was getting into? This is terrible. But let's say we change the story a bit. Let's say that instead of me just walking out on the ice and dying, one of you walked out or slipped out and you fell through the ice and I jumped in and I rescued you, but in the process I died. Would that be loving? See, it changes the story. And in the same way, the only way the death of Jesus can be anything but craziness, the only way it can be more than that, is if we were in a situation of peril that the death of Jesus has rescued us from. I think the reality is if we look at the cross just as some random guy in history dying, we should look at Jesus as one of the greatest lunatics of his time. In no way should we associate him with these values of love. But this idea that his death perhaps was to rescue us from something that we needed rescuing from, well, that would convey a sense of love and meaning. But I want to just turn to another objection I think that often comes up talking about this idea of the cross being a demonstration of God's love. And that's this idea of sacrifice. I think when we talk about God and sacrifice, maybe you read the Odyssey in high school or you're a classic student now, you might know the story of where Artemis requires Agamemnon to sacrifice his daughter in order for the weather to be favorable for him to leave. And we have this sense of these ugly, cruel gods, not gods of love, who demand sacrifices. And yet C.S. Lewis was a professor of English. He knew his Greek myths well. And I think that he would have made the case that the kind of sacrifice we're speaking about here is of a different kind than of Agamemnon and Artemis. It's a kind of sacrifice that actually is at the heart of the deepest stories of love that we know how to tell. I think one of my favorite stories in modern literature is Charles Dickens' book, A Tale of Two Cities. I'm still waiting for Christopher Nolan to make an awesome movie about it, because I think it's a great story that needs to be told. And what's interesting about the story, if you don't know what it's about, there are two men who fall in love with one woman. There's a guy named Charles Darnay and Sidney Carton, and they both fall in love with Lucy Manette. Now, Charles and Sidney actually resemble each other physically. They look pretty similar. They're both handsome men. But in terms of their character, Charles is much the better man. And so they both pursue Lucy, and Lucy at the end of the day chooses Charles, the better guy. And Sidney mostly fades from the storyline. Soon after, Lucy and Charles have a daughter, but then the French Revolution breaks out. Charles has an estate in France. He has to return there from England. The moment he crosses into France, he's arrested. Within a short matter of time, he finds himself condemned to death, and just within hours of awaiting his death by guillotine. And as he's in the prison cell, in the final moments of his life, he hears a knock on the door. And the person who comes in the door is the least person he expected. It's Sidney Carton, the old rival for his wife. And as he's confused at this rival coming into his room, and he's almost upset with him that he couldn't have gotten his wife to come and say goodbye to him, Sidney Carton comes in and takes smelling salts, knocks him unconscious, switches clothes with him, and then swaps spaces with him, and has Charles's body removed from the prison, and he takes his place. Within just a couple hours, the guards knock on the door, and Sidney is lined up with all the other prisoners in Charles' clothes, awaiting the guillotine. And there's another prisoner also on her way to her own death, a young seamstress who had known Charles, and she notices that the man wearing Charles' clothing is no longer Charles. And her eyes grow wide. And she looks at him and says, "Are you dying for him?" And he says, "Yes, and for his wife and his child." And at that moment, she actually asks if she can reach out to hold his hand for strength. There's something about that sacrifice, which wasn't even for her, but in her own moments of approaching her final death, her final moments, there was something about that sacrifice that was so beautiful, she literally wanted to take hold of it. And we're told that as Sidney walks up the gallows and looks out at the crowd for his final moments, he, if he had the chance, would have given this speech to the crowd, which, if you know, Tale of Two Cities is not your literary genre, this is actually from, it's quoted in The Dark Knight Rises, the Batman movie. Maybe you'll know it from that. No shame, no shame. Anyone love Batman movies here? No shame at all. Shame on you, shame on you. All right, here's the line that Sidney said he would have said to the crowd. "I see a beautiful city and a brilliant people rising from this abyss. I see the lives for which I lay down my life, peaceful, useful, prosperous, and happy. I see that I hold a sanctuary in their hearts and in the hearts of their descendants generations hence. It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known." What C.S. Lewis would say about this story is the reason why it moves you and me is because it's an echo of a larger reality, of a story not just written on the pages of a fiction book, but actually woven through the fabric of the way the world really is. The story of a God who came to earth to die for us, even though we didn't deserve it. The greatest love story ever told of a creator laying down his life for his creation. And I think as we return to the story, and this idea of God being love, maybe that's the way that you've always thought about God if he existed. But I think related to this problem of apathy is I think sometimes the God of love can feel a bit like Santa Claus to us. Santa Claus will always love you. Have you ever thought about that? If you're feeling down and it's around Christmas time, you can always go to the mall, and Santa Claus will always be there for you. He will always love you. You know, there's stories of him giving people coal, but we know that never really happens. Santa Claus will always love you. But Santa Claus doesn't change people's lives. I hope. And I think that's because, as nice as it is for Santa Claus's love to always be there, it's a kind of love that's a little shallow. He doesn't know you. It's nice that that love is always there, but it's not always real. And there's a pastor in New York City who I think puts words to why that kind of love, a shallow kind of omnipresent love up in the sky, I don't think has the power to actually make a difference in our lives. He says, you know, to be fully loved but not fully known is superficial. To be fully loved but not fully known is superficial because you can always be wondering, if this person really knew me, if they really saw me at my worst, would that love still be there? To be fully loved but not fully known is superficial, but, he says, to be fully known and not loved is our deepest fear. To have someone know you and see you to the depths and then to reject you, what could be worse than that? But he then goes on to say, to be fully known and fully loved is our heart's deepest desire. The kind of love that's at the heart of the message of the cross is that you are fully known by God because Jesus is on the cross for us, for you and for me, and the things that we have done, and he is there, and we are fully known as we look back at that awful reality and suffering. And yet, we are fully loved because God and Jesus are glad to do this for us. I think we are craving a source of love to meet the transcendent longing within us. I think even though we have mostly removed this second story and wanted to say it's just all cloudy, there is something within us that looks for that kind of apocalyptic love partner who can fulfill those longings within us. And I think what that reality points us to, I think in Becker's opinion, I think Charles Taylor would say as well, and these leading thinkers at our top universities, is that perhaps this is pointing to a larger vision of reality that involves a kind of love that is designed to meet that longing within our hearts. I'll end with this little story of, I got engaged a few months ago. And ladies, I'll just have to say, if someone proposes to you, a guy gets down, I pour out my heart, I have the ring there. It's a very vulnerable position for the guy. And you're just sort of hoping you don't get like slaughtered, like you're just going before like a giant grizzly bear or something like that. You're just like, it's vulnerable. Sympathize with us, But anyhow, I just, in that moment, when I poured out my heart to my fiancée and asked her to spend the rest of her life with me, she could have said no. And I think that would have been hard, but I would have to take that, right? But I think it wouldn't have been appropriate for her to say nothing. In other words, she could say yes and say, yes, I will marry you. That'd be wonderful. Or she can say no. But I think there's something about a radical, extravagant demonstration of love, a guy getting down on his knee to ask someone to spend the rest of their life with them, that calls for a response. A number of you maybe have been around a lot of these talks this week, and I think I study this, I did my graduate work in this field of philosophy and theology. I find this stuff fascinating, but I think there comes a time when, if we're looking at this objectively as it is, the possibility of this being God coming into the world to showing what he's actually like, and that coming at such great cost to himself, the laying down of his entire life for us, the God of the cosmos, I think we need to ask the question, if this really happened, how does it call me to respond? I think it's one thing we can say no to this and say, that's not for me. I don't like the kind of commitment that relationship would ask. But I think it's something we can't say no to, or can't say nothing to. And just as we close and wrap up now, we'll move to a time of Q&A. I just want to say, it might be there's some of you here who don't agree with anything I've said, and I'm so glad you're here. I'm looking forward to the Q&A and hope you have your questions ready. It might be that there's some of you here who would say, I have thought about these sorts of things, and I would like to chat further about them, whether you'd like maybe to meet up with someone, or maybe there's a course we have starting next week that's just a low-key, chill environment to have spiritual conversations over a meal once a week. It's called Alpha. But I think the only other possibility is that maybe you are here and you have heard some of these messages throughout the week, and you have this sense that this story of a God coming into the world and laying down his life for you is something that you sort of have a hunch that might actually be true. And if that's the case, I want to, just as I close, just to give you a very brief opportunity to step into that moment with God. And the way that I'll do that is just by closing with a brief prayer. Jesus is always asking people to follow him. That was the way he didn't, have like gospel tracts that he passed out or anything like that. He was always asking people to follow him. And I think what's powerful about that is you can feel like you're 10 kilometers away from God or 10 meters away from God. But the first step to follow him is the same. It involves a turning of the self and a decision to be touched by what he has done for us and to turn and live for him. So I'm just going to close now and just going to say a brief prayer. And if that's where you're at, and only if that's where you're at, I just invite you to pray along with me silently. And then we'll move to a time of Q&A. Well, bow your heads with me if you would. Heavenly Father, Lord, I feel when I sense the longing I have to be loved, that I'm aware that I have been looking for that love in so many places that aren't you. And I'm sorry, Father, for that, but I just thank you that you have recognized this longing I have for love, and you've stepped out of the cloud of unknowability. And I believe, God, you've made yourself knowable. And I thank you for making yourself knowable in the most loving way possible. I thank you for the cross. God, please, would you help me to turn to you and find in you the source of love and meaning and power and transcendence that I am longing for. Would you help me live for you? I pray this in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so thanks so much for your attention. Appreciate it. Thanks.